If we can just turn to 2 Corinthians chapter 10, 2 Corinthians chapter 10, I'm going to be talking about the consequences of ideas, the consequences of ideas. And I want to look at 2 Corinthians 10, verses 3 to 5, and then I'm going to take you to another portion of Scripture. 2 Corinthians 10, verses 3 to 5, the Apostle Paul writing here says, "For though we walk in the flesh, we are not waging war according to the flesh. For the weapons of our warfare are not of the flesh, but have divine power to destroy strongholds. We destroy arguments and every lofty opinion raised against the knowledge of God." So notice the apostle here says, look, our warfare is not like the world. We're not going out there with guns and bazookas and tanks. You know, we're not jihadis. We're not terrorists. So we don't go and fight with the warfare of the world. Our warfare is spiritual. It's not fleshly. It's not carnal. And then he goes on to say that what is our job? What is this type of warfare? This warfare, he says, involves destroying arguments. Now, this is very important. Notice he talks about strongholds there. And strongholds has to do with fortresses and walls and barricades to keep you out. So if you remember in The Lord of the Rings, they were going out to fight against the bad guys in Saruman, and they had those big fortress walls and so forth. And the idea was to break down those walls to take over the city, to take over and destroy it. And that's what Jesus meant when he said, the gates of Hades will never prevail against my church. Now, gates don't fight. They don't come jumping out and fighting against you. What it means is they won't be able to hold back the church of God. As the church of God advances, the church of God will tear down the walls. And so we need to understand something. Number one, we got to stop calling our get-togethers retreats, because the church of God doesn't retreat. The church of God always advances, always moves forward. So let's maybe try to find a better term for that. But the idea here is Paul is saying these strongholds are arguments. These are arguments that are doing what? He says these arguments and these lofty opinions, he says, they're raised against the knowledge of God. So all of these worldviews that we see in our world are against God. They're contrary to God. They're poised against Him. They're in opposition to Him. We need to understand this, that those who are in the flesh, the Bible says, cannot please God. They can't even keep the law of God because they can't. It's not that they won't, it's they can't. And of course, that affects their will as well, but they fundamentally cannot do this. And so all of these worldviews are in opposition to God's sovereignty. Man declared war against God in the Garden of Eden, and man has been running from God ever since. God is the one who has been offended here, deeply offended by our sin. And man, instead of running to God, if you notice, man has been running from God and hiding from God and covering his nakedness with his own justification, his own works, and so forth. So fundamentally, we're involved in a battle of ideas. What is the university and the colleges? They're supposed to be arenas of the battling out of ideas and challenging ideas. Today, we're seeing the suppression of that, where if you don't toe the party line, we simply fire you or evict you. Universities are no longer centers of disputing and debating and challenging ideas. Today, the universities have become indoctrination centers, where simply your children are being indoctrinated with social justice ideology and cultural Marxism. And so I've been hearing, as of late, more and more parents telling me, you won't believe this. My kid took a course on film studies at Humber College, and he's coming home talking about Karl Marx and talking about white privilege. What does that have to do with film studies? And someone else, Dr. Aaron's daughter, Kezia, was taking a course in social work at the University of Windsor. She had to write something on Karl Marx. What does that have to do with the price of eggs in Japan? Well, the fact of the matter is this. We are dealing now with a time period in which there is an ideology that has entered into our governments, into our schools, even our churches. You see critical race theory beginning to rear its ugly head in some of our churches, causing great divisions and schisms in our churches. And so what we're finding is there's an ideology that is being promoted both on the federal and to some extent provincially and the municipal levels of this country and in the West that is basically shutting down free speech. And it's shutting down any criticism of this ideology that says that you cannot question someone's You cannot question someone's sexual identity if they're males and they want to identify as females, or if they're females and they want to identify as males. Or there's a girl in Norway who identifies as a cat, walks on all fours, hisses at dogs, but funny enough doesn't use the litter box. Well, if she's a cat, she should go all the way. But she goes to the bathroom like everybody else. And so there's people who identify as dragons and they get their ears lopped off and they take their noses out and they try to configure their faces because they don't identify as humans anymore. Or it could be an ideology that basically says that the right to kill a child in the womb is a woman's reproductive right, and you have no right to protest and speak against that, because if you do so, you're not eligible for one of the parties in Canada, namely the Liberal Party. And if you speak against the evils of abortion, then you are anti-woman. You are against women. You want to put women back in the alleys so they can have these unsafe abortions and so forth. So what is the job of the Christian church? We are destroying these arguments. Paul says that we are doing what with these arguments? He says we destroy arguments. The Greek word is logismos. It's the word for reasonings, argumentation. And notice what he says. We're taking every thought captive to obey Christ. Christ is Lord. And Christ is Lord not just of the church, but he's Lord of all. And Christ is not Lord of all. He's not Lord at all. And Christ must be Lord over everything, our families, our jobs. Christ must be Lord over everything. And that doesn't mean we're going to create a society, a Christian nation. I'm not a theonomist, and I don't believe that we're called to be that, but we are to speak again God's truth into society. Now, if you look at Proverbs, the book of Proverbs in the Old Testament, we want to look at chapter 26. And wise King Solomon, whom the Lord Jesus said was the wisest man who ever lived, of course, with the exception of our Lord himself. Proverbs 26, verses 4-5, we're told here, answer not a fool according to his folly, lest you be like him yourself. Answer a fool according to his folly, lest he be wise in his own eyes. And when we look at these two verses, they look at face value to seem contradictory, but they're not. You'll notice the first verse, verse 4, answer not a fool according to his folly, lest you be like him yourself. What is this talking about? Well, it's basically saying that if you grant the argument of the fool, and the Bible defines who the fool is. Psalm 14, verse 1, and Psalm 53, verse 1 says, the fool has said in his heart, there is no God. The one who denies God and denies objective morality, because the word fool in Hebrew is the Hebrew word nabal, N-A-B-A-L, and it means someone who's deficient in moral values, someone who is morally deficient. And so the one who says there is no God will deny objective morality, which is true, it logically follows. Atheism has already granted that to us, that if God exists, then objective moral values exist. But since they don't believe he exists, there are no objective moral values. So if you answer the fool according to his folly and grant his argument, then you're just going to be just as foolish as he is. If you grant their worldview, if you're talking to an atheist and you say, yeah, you know what, I think, I didn't think of it like that, I think you're right, you've basically given him the argument. But notice the second verse, verse 5. Answer a fool according to his folly, lest he be wise in his own eyes. What is that saying? If you answer the fool and show his folly and demonstrate that his argument is inconsistent, and you demonstrate that his argument has holes in it, then what have you done? You've destroyed his pride, lest he be wise in his own eyes. So when I engage in debates or dialogue with people, whether they're atheists or Muslims or secular humanists or whatever the cults, it doesn't matter what they are, the moment you demonstrate that there is a crack in their foundation, well, what happens if you have cracks in your foundation? Well, the edifice isn't going to last too long. It's going to fall apart. If there are cracks in the pillars of your house or in the building, it's going to eventually collapse. And so the mark of truth is consistency. Truth is always consistent with itself. But when you demonstrate to someone that their worldview is inconsistent, then you have shown them that their worldview cannot be sustained, that their worldview has flaws. So, what is a worldview? Well, let me use my glasses as an example. A worldview is like a set of glasses. I put them on, voila. I see the world, I see colors, And these glasses define the world to me. They show me what the world is. Now, if these glasses were all, colored like pink roses, everything was pink, I put it on, wow, everything looks pink. Everything's pink, Dr. Aaron's pink, you're pink, the lights are pink, everything's pink. And so the worldview is the beginning point, the starting point. It's the grid through which we interpret reality. And so Plato said we all have to begin somewhere. We need a starting point. We need to begin somewhere, and your worldview will determine what you believe about where you came from, why you're here, where you're going, what makes humanity special, what is a human being. It'll determine what you believe about the afterlife. It will determine what you believe about morality. And therefore, whenever we're discussing, when I debate atheists on podcasts or in person, they will say something like this: well, the problem with you is, you're religious. You've got a bias. That's your worldview. And then you turn back and say, but you also have a worldview. Your worldview is atheistic. And you also have a bias against Christ, against the scriptures. You see, there's no neutrality here, folks. There's no neutrality when it comes to worldviews. Everyone has a worldview. They all have to begin somewhere. And so the atheist has a worldview. There is no God. There is no meaning and purpose to life. Humans have no objective intrinsic value or meaning or purpose. That's a worldview. Everyone has it. Every single. And so when they say, oh, well, you're being biased, well, you're being biased as well. And you're being biased when you say you don't have a bias. And so what we're finding in our day is that we're dealing with people who will confront us and they will challenge us. And our job as Christians is to be able to give answers to those who ask of us about the hope that we have. As Christians, we don't just proclaim Jesus Christ, we have to defend Jesus Christ. And so to give you an example of what I'm talking about, I think, Dr. Aaron, you remember when I was in Chatham, I was debating Dr. Noonan. Dr. Jeffrey Noonan is the chair of philosophy, I think he still is the chair of philosophy here at the University of Windsor, unless he's moved. And we were debating the existence of God in Chatham. And as we were talking, we were discussing objective morality, and he started saying things that were incommensurate with his worldview. He started talking about, well, we should be good to people. And I said, why? Why should we be good to people? Well, because we shouldn't harm people. It's wrong to harm. And the moment you say wrong, the moment you say right, the moment you say that something is good, something is bad, you are invoking a moral code immediately, a standard of some sort. And so he went on to say, well, you see, it's wrong to harm people, and that's bad. Well, here's the problem. Animals in the wild don't care if they harm other animals. In fact, a pack of hyenas will take down an antelope and will eat it while it's still alive. Lions will take down a zebra and eat it while it's still... Is that painful? Is that harmful? Do you think the pack of hyena cares whether or not they're inflicting pain on this other creature? Of course not. Animals don't have a moral compass. They run instinctively. They eat, they sleep, and they procreate. Repeat, and rinse. That's how they function. But you see, when it comes to human beings, that's a totally different story. When an animal kills another animal, we don't say that's murder. And when an animal steals food or meat from another animal, we don't say that's theft. But when humans do these things, we call them criminal offenses. And so what we need to understand is this. What Dr. Noonan was doing was, Francis Schaeffer said, we all live in a two-story universe. Think of the universe as having two floors, two levels. And Francis Schaeffer said that on the top world is the world of meaning and purpose and God and objective reality. And the bottom world is the world of relativism. Everything is relative. There's no objective reality, purpose. It's a mundane world. And Schaeffer said, dividing these two stories is the line of despair. And what he says is those who live in the first floor, they feel the despair of life because they have no reason for believing there's any meaning in the universe. They have no hope in the afterlife. And what they do, Schaeffer says, is they take leaps of faith where they jump to the second story to grab our language. And what Dr. Noonan was doing that day was and I told him that. I said, you are stealing my language. You have no right to use that because you don't believe in that world. And so atheists are inconsistent. I've never met a consistent atheist, because all atheists believe it's wrong to kill someone premeditatively, to murder someone in cold blood. I've not met one who thinks it's okay. I've never met an atheist who thinks it's okay to abuse children. I did meet one atheist who thought it was okay to rape if the culture allowed it. Now think about that. But what we need to understand is that in atheism, you cannot live a consistent life. And so what we find here is that atheists know that to live a life that basically says, well, there's no purpose in this, what I'm doing today has no purpose, where I came from has no purpose, where I'm going has no purpose. There are three basic cardinal questions that all humans have asked, and all philosophers have debated, and all theologians have debated. Three questions: where did I come from? Why am I here? And where am I going? And what answers those questions is your worldview. And so if I were to ask the atheist, where did I come from? They will say, well, you were just the byproduct of a fluke accident. You happened to be the right, the sperm of your dad fertilized the egg of your mother, and it just happened to be you. Okay, why am I here? Well, you're here because you're here. Make the best of it. This is the only life you have, because this is the only shot you've got at life. And where do I go when I die? Nowhere. You simply return to the elements. You simply go to the same place that dogs go to and cats go to. You go back into the earth. So essentially what they're saying is, you came from nothing, you are nothing, and you return to nothing. And isn't it surprised that some of the greatest atheistic minds of our day have argued that life really has no meaning? Like, take someone like Jean-Paul Sartre, the French existentialist philosopher, who said, man is a passionless being. Man has no ultimate meaning. Or Albert Camus, who said, man is simply a bubble on the ocean of nothingness. And you think about these words, and you begin to wonder, no wonder these existentialists said, why not commit suicide? And in fact, Ernest Hemingway, the famous film producer, did follow through on that. Ernest Hemingway, near the end of his life, committed suicide. Took a rifle to his mouth and pulled the trigger. And he wrote a suicide note basically saying that I have the right and I have the authority over my life, and I also have the right and the authority to choose the day I want to end my life. That is the Garden of Eden all over again. Man declaring war against God, saying, you have no right over me. You have no right over my life. You are not the one who created me, and you are not the one who will take away my life. I am God. And isn't that what the serpent said to Eve? For God knows that in the day you eat of that forbidden fruit, your eyes are going to be open, and you shall be like God, knowing good and evil. And so here we are in this world, a world that is progressively getting worse and worse and worse. We're living in a world right now in which there is a totalitarian ideology that has been in the works for 80 years. If you were here yesterday, you will remember that this was the work of the neo-Marxists. When Karl Marx came on the scene, he believed that the main problem with the world was economics, and he believed that the only solution was by destroying the distinctions between what he called the bourgeois, the capitalist, and the proletariat, the working classes. When you abolish that, and you overthrow the capitalists, then we'll have a utopian world. Well, that hasn't worked very well historically in Russia. It's not working very well in North Korea. It's not working that well in China. It's not working that well in Mozambique. It's not working that well in Venezuela or Cuba. And so we have 100+ million deaths. People were killed in all of these communist regimes. And Pol Pot took out 1/3 of the Cambodian people, decimated them. So, what do we all hear about today? Well, if you're a nasty person, the one word that they're going to choose to identify you with is you're a Nazi. And so Donald Trump is a Nazi. I've never seen a Nazi take the embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. That's a very Nazi thing to do. He has Jewish members in his family, but yet he's a Nazi. Go figure. Well, what's a Nazi? Well, anybody who opposes this totalitarian ideology called social justice. Now, let's not confuse social justice from the Bible with the social justice that is used today. In the Bible, social justice meant you take care of the vulnerable, you take care of widows, and you take care of orphans. and you take care among those among you. Paul says, let us do good to all men, but especially to those who are of the household of faith. The church historically has been the breadbasket of the world. Who do you think came up with the leper colonies and the blind missions? Who do you think created organizations like the Scott Mission, for example? Who do you think created the hospitals? They're all creations of the church. Who created the great universities of the world? Oxford, Yale, Princeton. Jonathan Edwards was the first principal, or president rather, at Princeton. The church has created the hospitals and the universities of the day. And the reason why they did that is because they believed that human beings were made in the image of God. And the focus is this: each one of you is a unique entity. There is no one like you in the whole world. Each one of you bears the imago Dei. You bear the image of the Creator. And that's why we think God's thoughts after Him. That's why we ask questions like, who am I? Why am I here? Where am I going? Is there a God? God has put that image stamped into you. And you derive your dignity. Your integrity comes from that image. It's not the Constitution or the Charter that gives you these rights and freedoms. Even our Constitution, our Charter of Rights and Freedoms says this. There's a preamble to the Charter, and this is what it says. Canada is founded upon the principle of the supremacy of God and the rule of law. Are we a country today based on the principle of the supremacy of God? Oh, how far we've gone. We've gone so far. We have forgotten our roots. And what we're seeing today is a movement that tries to, again, remove this image of God. And did you know that God created each one of us to be His vice regents on the earth? Did you know that Adam was made to be His governor general on the earth, to have dominion over the earth, to rule as an image bearer, as a prophet, as a priest, as a king, to have dominion? And what do we see today? Union Theological Seminary, they're all worshiping plants and praying to plants and asking plants to forgive them for how they treated the environment. And then you have people who are identifying as animals, cats and dogs. You see, when God made Adam, He says, I want you to have dominion over the creatures of the earth, over the birds of the air, the fish of the sea. I want you to have authority over the creeping things. And notice what man has done. Instead of being that crown of God's creation, the pinnacle of His creation, man has not evolved. He's de-evolved. He's degenerated to the point that the image bearer of God is worshiping that which is beneath him because he has lost sight of who he is. Humans are identifying today, they're identifying themselves with an identity crisis. And so what are we seeing? Well, this ideology, Karl Marx's communism, brought 100 million deaths. And everybody today, no one talks about Karl Marx. They just study him. But they'll attack Hitler, who also was equally evil. But there were far more deaths exponentially under communism than there was under Nazism. But yet today, it's not the communists that are being exposed. Why? Why? And I'll submit this to you. The reason why they're not being exposed is because all the professors are closet Marxists. They agree with Marx. They agree with his view of the oppressed versus the oppressor. If you want to understand our world today, you have to understand it in the paradigm of the oppressed and the oppressors. The oppressors are the church, Judeo-Christian principles, and primarily white Western European men or men who are descended from Western European countries. And who are the oppressed? Gay people, Black people, Asian people, Muslim people, Aboriginal people. Everyone else is oppressed. And what is the cause of their oppression? Christianity. The church brought suffering upon the Aboriginal peoples of Canada. Resident schools. The church brought about slavery. The slavery of many of the Africans who were shipped in boats to the Americas and to South America and to Brazil and so forth. The church is responsible for the Crusades. Those crusaders who went across Europe and into the Middle East and how they raped and pillaged and they destroyed and so forth and so on. And it's the church's fault why women have no equality. Women have no rights because the church is an establishment of the patriarchy. That's a really big buzzword in social justice studies. The idea is that the patriarchy, that men should control women and control everyone else, particularly white men, that is the bedrock, they say, of Christianity, because Christianity is a faith that is rooted in an ancient Near Eastern religion where they say the gods were predominantly male, and it was the male priesthood that ran everything. They ran the show, and all these white privileged males are the ones who are the cause of all this grief that we see today. Now, that's a lot of talk. That's a lot of rhetoric, but they're being untruthful. And I'll tell you why. Whenever you deal with people in the left, the social justice warriors, they will never engage in debate. And I've tried to get these guys to come out of the word work and let's debate. They won't debate, and this is why. Debating is a Western patriarchal concept designed by white men to have dominance over others. Logic is useless chatter. It's senseless. And all of these math books and all of these, the Magna Carta and the Declaration of Independence, they were all written by white men, patriarchal men. We don't trust history. And so what do they suggest? They revise history. It was one of the first things that Karl Marx said, the first order of business on the battlefield, Marx said, is to revise history, to rewrite it. And you'll notice when you deal with these folks, they don't want to engage in dialogue, so what do? They throw epithets at you. So I've been called Nazi scum. And they'll say it. They'll just say, Nazi scum, Nazi scum. And you almost got to go along with them and, you know, because that's all they do. They just throw epithets at you and they shut you down. It's not, you see, you got to realize something, folks. It's not about truth. Truth doesn't matter. Truth is a social construct. It's about power. Power over truth. And they will not rest until they take everything under their power. You just saw this about a month ago in Manitoba. 2 young girls were suspended from school because they wanted them to wear poppies with the rainbow colors on them to support the LGBTQ movement. And they stood up for their grandparents who were veterans in the war, many of them gave their lives and so forth. They stood up and says, no, we don't change the poppy. There's a reason why God made poppies red. But you see what they were trying to do is, you follow our ideology or else. It's not about truth, folks. It's about ideology. I've been called homophobic. And yet I talk to homosexuals. I'm not afraid of them. They say to me, you're a homophobe. I said, wait a minute. If I'm homophobic, phobia means an irrational fear of something. Do I have an irrational fear of you? Aren't we friends? I accept you. But you see, people confuse acceptance with affirmation. Just because you accept someone as a bearer of God's image doesn't mean you affirm their lifestyle. That's a false distinction. And so when I'm talking to them, they say, you're a homophobic person. Why? Well, because you don't agree with me. And I ask them, are you a heterophobic person? And they say, what do you mean by heterophobe? What do you mean by homophobe? You see, I can do it too. I can use your language and throw it back at you. You're a greasy heterophobe. Oh, sorry, I'm sorry I offended you there. I said, I'm not offended at all. These are useless words. This is what Orwell called newspeak. We're creating new words. And they become so politicized that when you ever hear the word homophobia, you're like, oh, sorry, I didn't mean that. Now, the Muslims are smart. They've jumped on the bandwagon. The Muslims are saying, if you say anything against Islam, you're an Islamophobe. You're being Islamophobic. So if I read the Quran and I disagree with it, I'm being Islamophobic. Yes. Are you Christophobic? Well, what's that? Hatred of Christians. You kill Christians, right? You've burned them alive when ISIS was in power, and you massacred all these Christians, and over 4,300 Christians have died, mostly in the Islamic world. You're Christophobic. What do? They don't know what to do with this. because now I'm playing their game. You see, there's inconsistency in their argumentation. It can't stand. And so because they know that they can't argue reasonably, what do? They throw slurs at you. That's all they've got. And so what we need to realize is this: social justice is not social justice. Social justice is simply another word for postmodernism, safe space, inclusivity, equality of outcome. What does that mean, equality of outcome? Well, right now, remember what our present Prime Minister said? He was going to have a 50-50 caucus. Half men, half women. What does that even mean? I mean, think about it this way. Universities were built on the concept of we only take the best of the best, because that's part of their, you want to become a medical doctor, they want to have students in their 90s. But what equality of outcome does is it says, we want to have an equal number of gay people in this class. We want to have an equal number of brown people in this class. We want to have an equal number of black people. What about white people? No, we don't need them. There was a professor who just resigned in Columbia University in New York. He was one of the world's leading professors in drama and English. And he left Romania because of the communism that was there. And when he came to Columbia, he began to realize something, that he was directing Shakespeare's Romeo and Juliet, and there was a young man who identified as a woman who wanted to play Juliet. And he said, sorry, I can't do that. Well, the student complained, and they said, well, you got to respect transgender rights, and you have to, and he says, listen, he said, I ran from communism in Romania, and now I'm finding it here. This is what they taught us. Compelled speech, compelled thinking. And then he was told that his classes had to be more you have to have this pluralism in the class. You need to have more gay people. You need to have more people over here who are white, not white, but they're the minority. You have blacks over here and brown over here. He said, and you know what he did? He resigned. He wasn't even fired. He says, I can't take this anymore. He said, Columbia University, he said, this is communism. And today I hear all these socialists, I see these students with the red flag, with the hammer and the sickle at the university saying, we got to bring socialism back. And I'm thinking, 100 million lives is not enough to show you that this is a failed system? How many more lives do we need to lose? You know what they always say? Well, that wasn't the true communism. The communism we're going to do, our communism is the real communism, really. So after 100 million deaths, you still don't know, you still haven't gotten it right. So what do we see, folks? Our kids are being affected by this. They're going to school and they're being told that they're not necessarily a boy. They may look like a boy on the outside, but they identify as a girl. You saw that case in Texas. There was a young boy and the parents are separated, and the mother was telling this little boy that he was a girl, and the little boy was trying to make his mom happy and says, okay, and she was dressing up like a little girl. And then when he was with his dad said, what are you talking about? He told his dad, he goes, Mommy wants me to be a girl, but I don't believe I'm a girl. And this even went to court. Think about that for a minute. And the mother was ready to take the child and have him transition, start pumping hormones into him. Like, think about that. Now, how is it that children as young as 6 and 7 can decide their gender? Why can't they drive a car? Why don't we give them licenses to drive a car? Why can't they drink alcohol? Why can't they vote at 6 or 7 years of age? Why can't they join the army? Oh, they can't do that because they're too young, they're minors. But they can choose their sexual gender? Something so stupendous as your identity? So here we are, folks. We're now in a day and age where we don't know what is male or female anymore. Men can be mothers, and mothers can be fathers. There was a news line I read the other day. It said, transgender man gives birth to boy. I thought it was the National Enquirer. Transgender man gives birth to boy. Now, wait a minute. If the transgender is a transgender man, why are you using gender with what he brought forth? So you have a transgender man who gives birth to a boy, but how do you know he's a boy? He hasn't made his decision yet. Maybe he's a girl. Do you see the inconsistencies here? And what that means is the transgender man was a woman who identified as a man. Well, the reason why she was able to give birth was because she had a uterus. You see, you can say whatever you think you are, but there's one thing God has put in us that will never deny who you are. God has put a biological blueprint in each one of us. And you could be walking around in stiletto heels and a skirt with a wig and say that you're a woman. But your DNA is crying out XY. You are a male. We're all born either XY or XX. If you're XX, you're a girl. If you're XY, you're a boy. DNA doesn't lie. Every part of your body, your DNA blueprint, your software cries out, you are a man, even though you think you're a woman. You can think whatever you are. But I saw a debate with Dr. Jordan Peterson and another professor from the University of Toronto, where this professor from the University of Toronto, who was teaching some weird LGBTQ studies, said binary sexes like male and female are not biological. They're social constructs. We invent them. You're not really born a man or a woman. You're not a boy or a girl. And I don't know if you were here yesterday, but Dr. Jordan Peterson is someone we should pray for. He needs Christ, but he's on our side. And he said many times that the biblical worldview, in his opinion, is the greatest worldview. It's the worldview that is the most coherent. So what I need you guys to understand is this. We're in a battle of ideas. You see, ideas do have consequences. And it was a young Austrian man who was imprisoned and placed in a jail in Austria who sat down and read a book by Nietzsche, the German philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche, who declared the death of God, the end of the 19th century. And he proposed the philosophy of nihilism, which is basically the philosophy that there is no meaning or purpose in life. And remember at the University of Toronto, I think I may have shared this way back in the other conferences, but University of Toronto, you always read the weirdest things on bathroom walls. And I saw the writing on the wall. And it said, God is dead. And it had Friedrich Nietzsche's signature underneath it. And underneath it, it said, Nietzsche is dead, signed God. Right. And it's interesting that Nietzsche, who believed that there was no meaning or purpose in life, Nietzsche went about saying that there was no God, there was no meaning, and yet in the end of his life, he ended up in an insane asylum, where he referred to the horses as his brothers and all types of things like that. So you see, the whole social justice framework is this, and I want you really to understand this, because you're going to hear more and more and more of this in the days ahead and the weeks ahead. The whole social justice framework is this. What defines you is your group identity. It's not you, it's not God. You are defined by your group. And therefore, if you are a gay person, then you are an oppressed group because you're gay, and the straight folks, the white straight folks, are the oppressors, the homophobes. If you are a black person, well, then you're also in an oppressed category because of your oppression that you experienced historically in the slave trade and so forth and so on. And if you are a black person and you're gay, you're even more oppressed. So there's degrees of oppression. So if you happen to be an asexual, bigender, transgendered, Asian gay person who's a lesbian, you're even more oppressed. This oppression game, it just keeps going on. And now they have intersectionality. That means that if you're gay and you're black, you're more oppressed. And there's degrees of oppression. And so you're defined by your group, you see. But you notice there's also a move here to do what? There's also a move here to eradicate nationhood, to eradicate borders. Why do you think there's such a push to stop the wall from being built in the southern states and Mexico? And everyone, it's because Trump's a racist. No, you got to understand, there's something insidious here. There's something insidious here. They want that wall to be torn down and there should be no boundaries. Now think about this. Who's talking about a global village? A post-nation state? Who's talking about globalism? where there are no distinctions, no borders. George Soros, our prime minister. And you need to understand something here, folks. This is so insidious on a spiritual level. They're trying to destroy nation states, and yet, who was the creator of nation states? God. Genesis 12, Abram, get out of your country. Go to a place that I will show you. I will make of you a great nation. And in you, all the families of the earth will be blessed. And in Acts 17, Paul says that God, when he created humans, he set the bounds of their existence, the boundary markers of where they would live and dwell. Why did God create nations? Because it's out of the nations, the diversity of the nations, that God would bring in his people. And when I read the book of Revelation, what does it show in the end? John says, I saw around the throne a great crowd of every nation, of every tongue, of every people. And they are all praising God, and they are glorifying the Lamb. Worthy are you. Worthy is the Lamb to receive glory, honor, power, praise. Why? Because you have redeemed humans from every nation and tribe and people. What is this? It's a return to Babel. Go back to Babel. What is Babel? The tower. Let us make a name for ourselves. We are one people, one language. And what does Babel refer to? Babel refers to confusion. Confusion of language, confusion of ideas, confusion of our identities. We're there now, folks. Why Babel? Well, the word babbler comes from the word Babel. When you babble, you're making no sense. You're babbling. And so what we're seeing is a move to go right back to the Tower of Babel. And what was the Tower of Babel? It was man's redeclaration of war against God. It was man trying to work his way up to heaven so that they could reach the heavens, and that resulted in the judgment of God. And Pentecost is the reversal of Babel, because in Babel, God used different languages to confound the people, and in Pentecost, he used the various languages to create his church and to unite people. Ideas have consequences. Don't ever let anyone fool you. Is your worldview consistent with what you believe? If it's not true. Truth is known by its consistency. And I submit to you that the gospel is this: God loved the world that he made. He loved the world so much that he gave his only son, who came down, became like one of us, to redeem us by grace. We're not made of races. There's no such thing as the black race and the Asian race and the white race. That's part of the divisiveness of this Darwinian concept that we all come from different groups. There's no such thing as races, folks. There's only one race, and it's the human race. And there's diversity of color in that one race, but that one race is all descended from Adam. From one blood, he has made all men on the earth. And so, brothers and sisters, I pray that as we go forward from this place, I pray that you will take this subject very seriously. Because if we do not, our children and our grandchildren will rise up and they will condemn us one day for not taking a stand when we could. The night is coming when no one can work. Let us work while it is still called day.